Thank you very much, Randall, and thank you everyone for welcoming me here tonight. I'd venture to guess that the timing of this is a little awkward, given that I'm talking about international affairs and in a matter of hours, an election that has had quite a crazy campaign going on locally is about to kick off. So, if you will bear with me a little bit, but I think you're going to be interested in some of the global matters that I'm viewing on the ground around the world as they pertain to the US and particularly to Trump and the Trump administration. I would, before I go any further, like to say I'd like to express my condolences to you regarding Ted. And likewise, I don't know if it's been brought up here, but I think we all lost someone very important, near and dear to me last year. That was Alex Alexiev, who had strong ties both here and strong ties in Bulgaria. And he's the person who essentially brought me to Bulgaria and was very much a mentor and the inspiration for me going around the world and doing the reporting that I've been doing over the past 5 years. So Ted is missed and Alex is very missed. Okay, so I'm going to make sure we've got time at the end for Q&A. I don't know exactly where you want to go. We can go in a lot of different directions. Over the past 5.5 years, I've spent a lot of time in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, also a bit around the Middle East, a lot of time in Turkey. I spent all of last winter, actually 4.5 months in East Africa, which has become a very interesting region geopolitically, particularly as it relates to China. I've just gotten back from a few months in Latin America. I landed in Bogota, Colombia back in the beginning of December. Spent a month in Colombia, made my way up through Central America, and then recently spent a month in Mexico. And there, I got a first-hand look at the migrant crisis in the Americas, as opposed to the migrant crisis in Europe that I had been seeing play out for the past 5 years or so. And if you recall, I spoke to you about that last time I was here. There are definitely similarities in what I saw on the migrant trails in Europe and on the migrant trails closer to home here in Latin America, but the issues are very much closer to home indeed here. So the migrants that I'm meeting in Latin America are obviously, by and large, trying to get to the US. Not all of them. A lot of them have given up hope, actually. And that has very much to do with the policies of the current administration. But most of these migrants, particularly those coming on the caravans you hear about and along those caravan routes, are coming up from the heart of Central America. At least I would call it the heart, right in the middle. We're talking Honduras and El Salvador, primarily Guatemala to some extent as well, but migrants from other countries as well. But the core of the migrant route goes up through Central America from around Honduras and El Salvador, up through Guatemala into Mexico, and eventually, if they make it that far, here, or Texas, or LA, or all over the country. Now, things have changed a bit because of Trump and America First and the policies that the Trump administration has been enacting. Something that I was lucky enough to see very closely was what's happening down at the Guatemalan-Mexican border. And that's really become a new hotspot. So for years, the US-Mexico border was the focal point of the migrant crisis in the Americas, and obviously it still is to a large extent, as there's supposed to be some wall going up spanning the entire border. But there was a very interesting development in recent months. And it's presumed because of Trump's tariff threats against the Mexican government. The Mexican government did a bit of a 180. So I don't know how familiar you are, the current president, he's known as AMLO down in Mexico, Lopez Obrador. He got elected as a leftist, bleeding heart liberal, basically, in the terms we would use to describe him here. However, down in Mexico City, he's facing fierce protests right now, predominantly coming from feminists and people fed up over attacks on women down there. And then further to the south, on the Guatemalan border, AMLO has deployed the new National Guard force. And that new National Guard force and what they're doing down at the Mexican-Guatemalan border in conjunction with the Mexican immigration officials are what some people are describing the new wall, or Trump's new wall. And when I was down there about a month, maybe a little more than a month ago, it was becoming very evident. So I arrived at the Guatemalan-Mexican border just about 3 days after a caravan had just arrived there and clashed with the Mexican National Guard, and there's lots of footage of it online. I spoke with quite a few members of that caravan, or people who arrived around that time, and it was pretty intense. The Mexican National Guard gave a bit of an ass whooping to the migrants. And this is quite a change of pace, because Mexico, for a while, had been the transit country. And they elected a leftist president who was supposed to be very favorable toward these migrants and to some extent hostile to Trump and Trump's initiatives. But in your eyes, this would probably be a glaring success for Trump. In that, in a sense now, he doesn't just have one wall, albeit this wall I don't think is complete, but he's got another wall. Now that wall, likewise, isn't complete. I've filmed migrants who are not Central American. They're dark-skinned, and they were speaking a Creole language. My best guess is they're from Haiti. I can't guarantee you that, but they weren't Central American. And I did film them crossing that river, being led by smugglers across the river that forms the border between Mexico and Guatemala. I got threatened because of that. I was lucky to make it out of there. So that border is porous. There are definitely still migrants making it across. And what I saw there is evidence that there still are people coming from different countries and different places in the world, not just Honduras and El Salvador like you might hear in the news. Albeit most of the people I met down there are from Honduras and El Salvador, Guatemala to a lesser extent. Then on my way up a little bit north through that region, I ran into a Czech on the side of the road. A taxi was driving me to an airport down there in southern Mexico. And when they stopped our car at this, I think it was a federales check, the Mexican federal police had a setup there on the side of the road. I figured they'd be interested in the taxi driver. They weren't interested in the taxi driver, they're interested in me and my papers. Even though I'm about as gringo or güero looking as it can get. And I can't tell you with certainty, but what I would extrapolate from that is that not only has AMLO's administration instituted an effective wall at the border by deploying his forces down there, but they've also got roadside checks all throughout that region, which has been reported in the news as well, to crack down on the migrants who do make it across that river or that border, like some of the ones I saw. Fast forward to last week, I was in Tijuana. And I did not see much of a migrant crisis in Tijuana. There are migrants in Tijuana. There are also a lot of deportees. In fact, all along these migrant trails in Mexico, I've run into lots of deportees. Predominantly deportees in recent years, in Trump years, but deportees from prior years as well. But it was very evident that there was much more of a crisis down at Mexico's southern border, just in terms of optics. Not in terms of crunching numbers and statistics, but in terms of optics. There are lots of migrants when I was there, wandering around town on the Mexican-Guatemalan border trying to get into Mexico. It wasn't that case in Tijuana. And I think that you can take away from that Trump's tactics, whatever you want to call it. You want to call it shrewd negotiating. You want to call it bullying. You want to call it bullying Mexico into being the wall and paying for the wall. It's having an effect. It is.
Mexico's paying for it.
We could discuss tariffs, which Trump has been very shrewd in using in negotiations. Not just with regard to Mexico. I've seen this all over the world. It's come up in a lot of my coverage in Europe, even. I mean, this applies. Trump's use of tariffs as a threat or negotiating tactic, or you might call it a stick, comes up all around the world. Comes up with China. And it comes up with partners, or once partners of the US, friends, allies, or whatever you want to call them, such as the EU, for instance. So, what was it, a couple of years ago, the EU decided to have a big meeting in Sofia, Bulgaria, of all places. So, I happened to be there. And this meeting was supposed to be about the Western Balkans. It was supposed to be about integrating the Western Balkans into the European Union. This large chunk, or fairly large chunk of the continent that is predominantly out of the European Union but wants to get in. And if with the UK leaving and with the EU in a sense having an existential crisis, you'd think that they really are going to place a focus on what they can do to show their vitality and that they're going to last and expand and grow and welcome in the Western Balkans. So I arrive in this meeting and the head honchos are there. Jean-Claude Juncker, the European Commission president at the time, and Donald Tusk, the European Council. Maybe you're not familiar with these terms, but in a sense, well, we have our committees here. We have our bodies like the Air District and whatnot that are in a sense super city, super county or whatever, like they layers above your elected officials. In a sense, that's what you have in Europe. You have a European Commission that sits above the 28, now 27 member states. So I'm sitting there in this room, the head honchos walk in, and Donald Tusk steps up to the podium. This is supposed to be about the Western Balkans. He gets up there and says nothing about the Western Balkans. Maybe at the end he gave some PR statement. He immediately discusses Trump and Iran. And specifically, Tusk says something along the lines, not verbatim, although it might be, with friends like this, I can't do the accent. He's Polish. With friends like this, who needs enemies? Who is he referring to? Tusk was referring to Trump, but specifically in response to Trump pulling out of the Iran deal. And why? Because when Trump pulls out of a deal that involves trade or cutting off trade relations or stifling trade relations or imposing sanctions, tariffs foreseeably, Trump wants his so-called partners to comply with that. In this case, he wanted the European Union essentially to stop doing business with Iran. And the European Union wanted to keep doing business with Iran. And what I'm starting to get at is that America First could largely be seen, especially in this audience, as a major success. However, it is a quite combative policy. And the world, especially these migrants down on the Mexican-Guatemalan border, the deportees in Tijuana, the migrants who have lost hope and have already headed back to Honduras or El Salvador, or even European elites. This came up at the Bilderberg conference last year, which is highly secretive, but I interviewed someone who attended, and she attested to the fact that there was a striking divide in the room between the Americans and the Europeans, or at least between what she would refer to as the American position and the European position. And the American position, at least that was coming out of the Trump administration, and at this Bilderberg conference, Mike Pompeo was in attendance for a day, as was Jared Kushner. At this conference, according to this Turkish economist who I interviewed who was there, she was saying that the American position was such that the US is, at least in the eyes of the Europeans, fighting a technological Cold War with China. And if the US is going to have a trade war with China, it expects Europe to be on board with that trade war with China. And Europe's not on board with that. The EU, that is. And this is the case in a lot of places around the world. And to this room, what you're hearing from me, and probably what you've already made up from your own mind, like I said, America First could very well be a whopping success. And I think there are arguments to be made. If you're expecting Trump to cut down on mass immigration, I don't have the numbers for you. I can't run the numbers for you. But I can tell you from the people I've come across over the past 3 months in Latin America, the sentiments among the migrants are down. They're gloomy. They don't have the determination they used to have. There are deportees who are saying they have no interest in going back to the US. We hear all the time about the guy who came here illegally, committed some crime, went back across the border, came back, committed some crime, went back and forth 7 times before ultimately something bad happened. Among the deportees who I spoke with, some of whom spent a lot of time in the US, 10 years, 15 years, maybe even more, there was very much a lack of optimism, but almost complete loss of hope. And you all might view that as very positive. And this is in stark contrast to what they think of the prior administration. I've heard repeatedly from migrants on the migrant trail in Latin America that the Obama years were the good years. Some of these guys spent the Obama years in this country. Others just have notions that they advocate or repeat. I've heard repeatedly, Trump is racist. Trump is racist. Trump hates brown people. Trump also hates black people, but I'm more concerned that he hates brown people. These are sentiments that I hear expressed to me a lot. Now, I'm not going to demean all these guys. Some of these people, if I were to take them at their word, and I must say, from all the interviews I do around the world, especially with migrants, I've done many. Many of the Latin American migrants were extremely forthcoming. I haven't published some of the interviews I've had, but I had guys go on camera, open up their passport, show their actual name. I think one guy even showed his deportation stamp, if there was one. Told his story about what exactly happened, opened up about getting into legal trouble here, domestic violence, alcohol issues. And I also saw that in a different way down at the Colombian-Venezuelan border, something I didn't get into, but maybe you want to ask about. That's a whole nother crisis. And that might very well be something you'd be interested in taking a closer look at if, say, after this primary season, we're looking at Trump versus Bernie. Because many people in Latin America view what's going on in Venezuela and Venezuela's clash with some of its neighbors as simply socialism versus capitalism. But like I was saying, all around the world, America First can be viewed as combative. And I think a lot of you are pleased to hear that. How much time do we have for questions?
You have about another 5 minutes for presentation, and 10 minutes after that.
Oh, perfect. Then I'll keep going. I was a bit concerned about time. Well, questions in 5 minutes. Would you like to hear a bit more about the Latin American migrant trails?
Yes.
Or perchance the migrant situation in Europe?
The European, I would like to hear about.
Africa, East Africa, China?
The migrant, yeah, the Eastern European migrants.
All right,
What's going on over there?
so this is timely. I'm very grateful to be back. I'm very grateful to be visiting with friends and family. It's overdue. I've been in the US for about 30 days out of the past 5.5 years. However, I don't know how much you guys have been following, because obviously there's an election here, but things are really heating up over in and around Turkey and Syria, but things are always hot in Syria. So right now there's a new crisis, migrant crisis, on the Turkish-Greek border. And frankly speaking, I'm happy to be here, but I'd rather be there. Because that's what I do. That's what I love doing. I love hanging out in these migrant camps on these borders and meeting people. And I've done a lot of that in that part of the world. And last time I was here, I shared with you my experience from the peak of the migrant crisis back in late 2015, early 2016. And I was telling you how, yes, there were legitimate asylum seekers or refugees coming from Syria, coming from Iraq, coming from Afghanistan, arguably some from some other countries. And there were many, many, many opportunists coming along with them from all over the world, including all over Africa, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, all over the Middle East, and many countries. Since then, I've had the privilege of, to some extent, tracking the lives of some of those people who made the journey and succeeded and are now living in European countries. And I would say the most interesting experience I had with regard to that was last year in Lucerne, Switzerland. So I'm sure you all know Switzerland is a rich country. Things in Switzerland they're pretty nice. Lucerne is a beautiful city, very beautiful, wealthy, not what you'd think as a typical migrant destination. Although, surprisingly, I've seen many migrants in Lucerne, including from the Horn of Africa, including from the Middle East, and particularly Afghanistan. So my interesting experience was that because of certain reporting I did several years back, I ended up befriending some Afghan asylum seekers who were very legitimate asylum seekers. And one of them let me stay in his government-funded apartment in Lucerne last year. So I got to live with the Afghan asylum seekers, some of whom are getting approved, some of whom are getting rejected, in Lucerne, Switzerland for a week or more. And my friend who was hosting me, I would say he's putting in a good faith effort, at the least. He's learning Swiss German. That's not easy. He's actually a journalist as well, and he's working at some Swiss broadcast news program for foreigners living in the country, something like that. And he's studying and he's picking up the language. However, what I saw from most of his friends was about the polar opposite. I saw some sit around and, other than prepare meals a couple times a day, do nothing but play Game Boy or whatever the latest device is all day long, and speak no Swiss German, and speak no English either, nor of course French or Italian or anything that might be useful in Switzerland. And this has been the case with many of the migrants in many European countries. There's been a major assimilation problem. I would say that, taking culture into account, there's a very significant difference between the Afghans in Switzerland and the Hondurans in Los Angeles, in Atascadero, in Texas, etc. I would say that the Hondurans here are culturally closer to us than the Afghans in Switzerland. However, what I also came across is that among the majority of the deportees I met, the majority either spoke little to no English or next to no or none. Spoke no English at all. Some of them had been living in the US for a significant amount of time and didn't speak any English at all. Out of all the deportees I met, maybe a couple spoke what I would say is close to fluent English, or arguably fluent English. Some of them might have been fantastic workers, might have been very skilled. Some shared some very hard stories with me about getting deported. And to them, they did nothing wrong. There's an attitude that as a Latin American immigrant, it's a common attitude I came across. If you come to the US, and immigration status aside, follow the rules, don't commit crimes, you have a job and you work, then that's something very honorable to do. And you're not doing anything wrong. And there's no reason for you to get kicked out. And if one day an ICE officer comes and pulls you off of your construction job, and you go to jail and then get deported, you've been wronged. It's a very common sentiment. And I'll let you make up your mind on that. All right, we need to take some questions, huh?
Yeah.
Wait, hang on just a second. Let me get over to who wants to speak.
There was an early hand off that direction.
Okay.
Please stand up with your question.
I was just wondering if you could ascertain the people that were coming from South America a while back, several months ago.
South or Central?
Well, the Venezuelans and people like that, and the Hondurans and such. Do you think that somebody in the United States promised them welfare stipends if they came to the United States? Do you think that's how they got the idea in their head that this is the best place to come?
There are two different points of that I want to address. The first point, you brought up Venezuelans and Hondurans. And this is something I skipped over. I haven't been in Venezuela. Well, technically I might have stepped foot in the country accidentally. And if by any chance you follow me on Facebook or Instagram, the Venezuelan, they're not the border guards, they're I forget what the term is, but yeah, those Venezuelan soldiers on the border, they weren't too keen on me being there with a camera. But nonetheless, Venezuela and Honduras are in different situations, and the people fleeing Venezuela and fleeing Honduras are, generally speaking, fleeing for distinct reasons. In Colombia, right next to the Venezuelan border, there are thousands of Venezuelans pouring in every day. When I was there back around Christmas, when I interviewed the UNHCR workers there, they told me that about 40,000 people cross the border from Venezuela to Colombia every day. That one border crossing. Of those 40,000, according to UNHCR and other people in the area have basically vouched for something along these numbers, out of those 40,000, 35,000 head back to Venezuela that same day. And I've got video of this. They're hauling toilet paper and Pepsi and water and all kinds of basic supplies from Cucuta, Colombia, back into Venezuela. They're walking, sometimes carrying huge packages, sometimes there are all these guys who work at the border who have the job of carrying all these basic supplies across for people who can't carry it all. This is happening every day. Likewise, they're in Colombia, right next to the Venezuelan border. I came across a new phenomenon I'd never heard of before or seen. I was told, you got to see the walkers. I said, who are the walkers? What are walkers? Is this something from some film? I don't know what a walker is. Well, what's a walker? So a walker down there is a person, and there are many of these people, some of whom are pregnant, I have footage of that, who believe that they're so broke or there's no alternative, they can't get a bus ride or whatnot, that once they cross the border from Venezuela into Colombia, they literally walk to Bogota, the Colombian capital, or to Ecuador, or to Peru, or to some neighboring country, or wherever their ultimate destination is. They're so poor and they know no alternative that they're willing to walk hundreds of miles in hope of getting to a better life or getting to some place where they have family. In Central America, there's poverty. There are gangs. I heard about it from the migrants. Out of everyone I interviewed coming from Honduras and El Salvador, almost entirely people were saying they're seeking a better life. Some of them were even willing to go to Mexico. But they weren't in a situation where they're hauling toilet paper back across the border. So there's a clear distinction between Venezuela and Honduras, El Salvador, and what's going on the Central American migrant trails.
But Josh, do you think that any of them were promised anything or told?
That's the second point I'm getting at. So I think I addressed this last time I was here. But when I was on the migrant trails in the Balkans, in Turkey, let's just call it Eastern Europe, back 5 years ago, right and left, there would be migrants coming up to me, asking me specific questions. Like, if I go to Norway, will I get 1,000 euros a month or 2,000 euros a month? If I go to this country, will I get an apartment and will I get this much money? And back during the peak of the European migrant crisis 5 years ago, people have been promised everything. There's smugglers all over the place telling them you're going to get these blonde Swedish women and you're going to get an apartment and you're going to get stipends, and to some extent that's true. I forgot to mention, when I was in Switzerland, the migrants who are granted asylum, the legitimate refugees, get approximately, they get an apartment that's worth something like 900 or 1,000 francs, which is $1 a month. And then they get a stipend, I'm forgetting exactly how much, but it's something along that lines also, plus the government pays for their education if they pursue education and whatnot. So, and Switzerland's a country that's not so friendly to migrants, at least compared to its neighbors. Not compared to Eastern Europe. Which, by the way, if there was one region I would say where people are pretty on board with MAGA, I'd say Eastern Europe's a place. Not everyone, but people pretty on board. But anyway, what I came across on the migrant trails in Central America was different. My best guess, having lived here, worked here as a reporter, gone back and forth between the Social Security office many times for Calcos News, is welfare has become embedded in the culture. That's not to say every migrant is seeking welfare, or people are coming with specific notions like they're going to be able to collect this, collect that. Some of the people I interviewed made vague references to wanting to receive benefits or be taken care of because they're in some very bad situation. But it was nothing like what I came across in Eastern Europe. That's not to say there's no welfare problem here. I mean, we can be real here. Yes. There's a welfare problem here. But specifically, what I was hearing and coming across from the migrants, there was a stark contrast between the ones in Central America, who almost all of them make it clear they want to work. And a lot of them, you look them in the eye and they seem to mean it. And I don't get that impression nearly to that extent with many of the migrants I've met coming to Europe. I hope that answers the question.
You want to go ahead and select the next one? I don't want to get hurt.
All right, hands. One of the back.
Sheila.
I was wondering if you noticed any homeless, the way we have the homeless crisis here, and if so, who are the homeless there? Are they migrants or are they people that are actually locals? What did you think?
I'll speak to Tijuana because I was just there and I just got run out of town by homeless. And yes, okay, so last week I was down in Tijuana. Unfortunately, I didn't have so much time to do reporting there, but on my last day there, right before crossing the border by foot, I hung out right along the border in what's effectively a homeless encampment. And it was a very interesting homeless encampment. Lots of drugs being done everywhere, hard drugs, not soft drugs, hard drugs. There were at least a couple people there who spoke basically fluent English. One guy there who I befriended for a little bit, then when I started filming, he didn't like me anymore. But this was an interesting case. The man whom I met in Tijuana. He looked like a homeless guy, basically was a homeless guy. He's carrying around stuff like you'd see a homeless guy carry around here. And I approached him speaking my broken Spanish. He right away responded to me in English. He spoke fluent English. He spoke English with an American accent. He spoke Spanish with an American accent, which is not something I come across very often, at least down there, and when we're excluding gringos. But what he told me is that he came to the US as a little kid and grew up here. And his accent and language skills seemed to vouch for that story. And he said that he was doing pretty well, selling cars or whatnot in Arizona and had a nice life. He said he was actually living in a gated community and then ran into whatever kind of problems, drugs, legal problems, and was deported. And he showed me around this homeless encampment area, right on the border, right by the river there, right next to San Diego, or San Ysidro over there. And my impression was that pretty much everyone at this homeless encampment on the border, I can't say everyone, and it was too dangerous for me to go around interviewing them all, but my impression was that at least a lot of them were deportees or Central American migrants or both. Some maybe Mexican nationals, like in the case of the man I met, who had been deported. But it was clear that among that group, there were ties to the US. Because the first two people I speak to speak fluent or close to fluent English. Does that answer the homeless question?
Right, well, in all your other travels, did that also, were there homeless there and
The-
were they migrants?
This varies tremendously based on country. Some countries, you go there and you see they tend to take care of their downtrodden. Mexico, it's more like here. You see homeless people all over the place. Yes,
One more
right here.
question. In Switzerland, did you find anything important about the cantons?
I mean, are you asking this with respect to their
Right.
system of governance? What are you?
The system of government being like the counties of Switzerland. Each section has a canton that they take care of their problems. Did you find anything in that vein?
Oh,
Local?
that's true. Switzerland is more decentralized than most countries in Europe. Most countries, period, for that matter. And with regard to the migrants, it does vary canton to canton. So some cantons are stricter with their handling of migrants. Others are a little looser.
but they're personal. They're more distinctive. What I'm thinking is San Luis Obispo County is not Fresno County, or LA County, or San Francisco County. And I see that in our government, we have taken things from Switzerland, like the initiative system, that goes over the heads of the legislators to get a measure on the ballot, which is what we're trying to do in a committee here in San Luis Obispo.
In Switzerland, the people have far more power to vote than pretty much countries around the world. Their referendum, I mean, what's our referendum system is something that's very common there, and they can vote on all kinds of laws, and it happens all the time. It's a much more decentralized system, and it's much more of what people typically refer to as direct democracy.
Very good question. Okay, we got, this is turning into a discussion, so talk with me afterwards. We're gonna get you up there.
Yep.
All right. We got one more question here. All right, and then we gotta wrap it up because we're going long. Sorry about that.
Hey, Jason, good to see you.
Josh.
Josh, I'm sorry. Jason. Talking to Jason. Josh, good to see you. Did you find any evidence of the Muslim Trail still in, coming through,
The Americas?
triangle? Yeah,
Which triangle?
Guatemala. Guatemala, there used to be a Muslim trail that came through there, a direct import to here.
While I was there, no. That's not to say there isn't, but it brings up, I guess, the religion point. And it's not something I'm very familiar with, and it's not something that I came across. It's not to say there aren't Muslims coming up through the Americas to here, but nothing like on Europe's migrant trails, which is a cultural aspect that I didn't touch on, but I guess it's implied that we're talking about mass migration from Africa, where it's very split religiously, but in North Africa, that's mass Muslim migration to Europe. And in the Middle East, obviously, mass Muslim migration to Europe, and something much different from here. And something I came across among the migrants who are very frustrated with Trump and America First is a bunch of them, some of whom are, well, as I'm interviewing them, they're wearing a cross. And they're saying, look, we're Christian. Donald Trump, we are Christian. We are Christian. I want you to know we're Christian. We're hard workers. We're not coming to cause problems. So there are clear cultural distinctions between the migrant trail here in the Americas and the migrant trail in Europe. And it's really in your face, actually. There have been occasions in which I walk up to migrants on a border, at some border camp where they're piled up. I'll walk up to them. It's not always, but it's happened. It's happened at least a couple occasions. And I go to introduce myself, and right away I get the question, what's your religion? And obviously I have the wrong answer. So I don't have a direct answer to the...
Well, it used to come from Eastern Europe to Guatemala because it's easier to cross the border there and the arrangements to get into the United States. That's where most of them in Minnesota and Michigan have come from.
That may be. I haven't looked into that, although I know there's a large Muslim migrant community up there. But what I would say is that based on the reporting I did there, videoing the group that presumably is Haitian, presumably not Muslim, but nonetheless, they're not Honduran, they're not Salvadorian, they're not Guatemalan. It's obvious. So I have for you evidence that as is the case in Europe, there are opportunists who exploit the caravans and exploit the migrant routes, and the systems with the smugglers exploit them as well, and they come to the US, or they try to, and they keep coming even when the odds are against them.
Perfect.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.